Hello and welcome everyone to the webinar on selecting and managing cover crops. This webinar is part of the Organic Farming and Soil Health in the Western U.S. webinar series, organized by the Organic Farming Research Foundation with funding from Western SARE. I'm your host, Alice Formiga from eOrganic. eOrganic has many articles, videos, and webinars about organic farming and research, and you can find all of them by typing webinars by eOrganic into a search engine. And you can also find the recordings of all the webinars on the eOrganic YouTube channel. We are recording this webinar, and we will have the recording available on YouTube within 1 to 2 weeks. The webinar will last about 45 minutes to an hour, probably closer to an hour, and when it's over, we'll have 30 minutes for questions. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the Q&A box on your webinar control panel at any time. If you don't see the Q&A box, there should be a black bar with some controls if you hover over the bottom of your screen, and if you click on the Q&A one, that should pull it up. There's also a chat box which you can use, and you can share things with the panelists and also with all the other attendees using a little drop down in the chat box. So I would like to welcome back our presenter today, Mark Schoenbeck. Mark is a research associate at the Organic Farming Research Foundation, and he has worked for 31 years as a researcher, consultant, and educator in sustainable and organic agriculture. He's also been very active in the Virginia Association for Biological Farming. We are also joined today by Eric Brennan, who is with us from the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Salinas, California, where he's worked since 2001. Eric's research focuses on vegetable and strawberry production with emphasis on cover crops, weed and soil fertility management, and biological control of insect pests. So Mark is going to present the webinar, and then Eric will be with us online for the question and answer time. So Mark, I'm going to hand over the remote control to you, and as a reminder, just click on the screen to activate it.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for joining us, everyone. I'll be talking rather out of my region. It's been an interesting challenge to wrap my head around how best to use cover crops and select them in environments that are either very low rainfall or have all the rainfall in the winter. But let's have a go at it. I will start with, I think I will anyway. Let's try that again.
Okay, you got it.
Okay, good. Thank you. So we'll start with the results of a survey that the Organic Farming Research Foundation conducted in 2015 as a basis for their publication that you see here on the left-hand part of the slide, National Organic Research Agenda. Basically to find out what the leading priorities for research topics within organic agriculture were. 555 of the respondents were from the Western region, and soil health, as was true for all regions, emerged as a top priority with 71%, considering it to be a high priority topic. And then right behind it was fertility management at 66%. And some cover crop topics that came up within this under these headings are cover cropping for limited moisture, and that was also revealed in earlier Western SARE webinars. We're talking on other topics, and we're asking, well, what do we do? We only have 7 inches of rain a year in the way of cover cropping, and etc. Another one that came up was cover crops fertility in perennial crops, and specifically nitrogen fixing crops for arid regions, and also cover cropping alleys for weed control and other benefits, again, arid regions, in this case, irrigated systems. So we'll go over some basic concept here. I'll probably go through this fairly quickly. And I want to mention there's going to be a fairly extensive set of presentation notes, which will fill in a lot of the details that I won't have time to go over today. So if we kind of skim through this first section and you want more in-depth, check out the archive. As I said, there'll be presentation notes with that. Okay. So we all know what the soil health benefits of cover crops are. Example is this nice tall crop of fava beans is growing in Woodland, California. You can see the biomass there and the tremendous amount of nitrogen is being fixed and returned to the soil. Of course, a cover crop like that will pretty much stop erosion unless you have really extreme weather. Good at relieving compaction, of course, building organic matter, feeding the soil biota, and recovering nutrients, in this case, fixing nitrogen as well. And one thing that's very important that cover crops contribute in the long run in limited rainfall environments is they will enhance the moisture holding capacity of the soil. And they do that in part by opening up the soil profile and improving aeration, giving more water and air holding capacity. So I'll quickly go over the four principles of soil health management that the Natural Resources Conservation Services developed. The first one is keep the soil covered. Bare soil is burning up in the sun, getting pounded by the rain, rapidly losing organic matter. Another thing that happens in bare soil is the soil life's going hungry. So ways to keep the soil covered is winter cover crops. Anytime you have like a summer or spring production and you have some time in the winter when you're not in production, you really want to have something growing there, unless you're in a part of the West that is so cold that it's not possible to have anything actively growing, in which case dormant cover or frost-killed cover crop residues will serve to give that surface protection. Warm season cover crops, if you have a gap in the rotation during the summer. If you're in a region with a very dry summer, this can also be accomplished by a cover crop that is either terminated before it uses too much moisture or is naturally killed by the increasing heat and drought, but leave those residues on the surface for sure. You can also interplant cover crops into cash crops, so we'll see a few examples of that later on. Another important thing is if you've got orchard or vineyard or berry crops with wide alleys, you definitely want at least a good part of the orchard floor covered, if not the entire soil area. Next one is to maximize living roots. Here's a picture of a sorghum Sudan grass grown in the special chamber. You can see the roots that go all the way down to that 5-foot tall enclosure. Pearl millet is another one. It can send roots 5 to 7 feet deep, even if there is hard pan or highly acidic, high aluminum subsoils. It'll just go right on through it. And these living cover crops do a lot of valuable things. They feed the soil life. That's really the staple in the diet of most soil organisms, is what comes out of the plant roots while they're living, and also after the plant dies or has left some of its smaller roots. Penetrating hard pan, maintaining soil structure, valuable contributions of that living root. And they really play a big role in long-term soil fertility, and both in terms of active organic matter that releases crop nutrients, and in terms of building stable organic matter that lasts for a long time, sequesters carbon, maintains soil health and habitat for soil life. And deep roots recover leach nutrients. You have a crop with a vigorous root system to 5 or 6 feet, and it's growing like this, vigorous on top. It can basically cleanse all the excess nitrate out of the soil profile all the way down to pretty much to the root tips. And because it's recovering those leach nutrients, it's reducing fertilizer bills. We'll see a really dramatic result of that nutrient recovery a little later on in the webinar. Another one, third principle, is increasing crop diversity. Every time that you add another crop, either to your rotation or to your cover crop mix, this is just like an example of a 5-way cover crop mix, different root architectures, and each root system, each plant species will contribute its own particular microbiome. It has certain organisms that it encourages and fosters to grow in its root zone. And when you have diversity, then you have a wider range of functions, and the various organisms, you can have organisms that fix nitrogen, retain and cycle nutrients, mycorrhizal fungi and some bacteria and some other fungi will partner with plant roots in a number of very interesting and usually very helpful ways. A lot of these organisms suppress plant disease in one way or another, and of course they're maintaining tilth and building organic matter. It's a continual process to maintain these two important parts of soil health. The fourth principle is minimize disturbance, and this is the challenging one for everyone. Because if you're going to go totally no-till, you will need some herbicides, so you're going to have a little chemical disturbance going on. If you're growing annual crops, you got to manage the cover crop, got to keep the weeds down. If you're organic, certified organic, you cannot use those herbicides. You are going to till some. However, there are ways to manage a cover crop without losing all the benefits that have accrued during the cover crop's growth. Like this rototiller has been set to work fairly shallow, just deep enough to mix the residue, which has been mowed, so it's easier to work in. And it was a good, tall, thick cover crop. You can see it over here, but it wasn't cut. And now it's being worked in. That rototiller can be set to work just a couple inches deep. Now, the cover crop reduces soil disturbance in a number of ways. I think the most important one is that if you're growing a cover crop between your cash crops, you're maintaining a continuing supply of that lifeline for the soil life, the food that the roots continually add. And you're reducing fertilizer needs, and that means any concentrated fertilizer can have some disturbing effect on the soil life. So if the less you have to add, the better off you are. Then, of course, when you have good cover cropping practices that keep the weeds down, you will not have to cultivate as much. So that's a reduction of physical disturbance during cash crop production. And as I mentioned, you're going to have to till in the cover crop. So that is the one challenge or drawback for cover cropping in an organic system. So I just wanted to mention that the National Organic Standards actually require cover cropping and other forms of cover crops, including sod, which is like a perennial cover, which you introduce into a crop rotation to rebuild the soil. Green manure crop is just a term for a cover crop that is tilled in to release its nutrients quickly. And a catch crop is a term for a crop that scavenges nutrients, like those deep-rooted grasses that will take all the nitrate out of the soil profile down to pretty much to the depth. So just a quick review of how living plant, why it plays such a vital role in all aspects of soil health. It's how carbon gets into the soil. I mean, that's the way it's been for 450 million years, ever since land plants evolved. And of course, they protect the soil surface, and they're the activity is constantly rebuilding and maintaining tilth and the soil life. And the deep-rooted crops are opening up the soil profile. So here's a concept that I've read. I wish I could remember the researcher, the scientist that introduced it. Sustainable crop intensification. Basically, that means that the more of the year you've got living roots and the more biomass you produce per year on average over the rotation, the more you are feeding the soil and protecting it. So generally, a lot of studies have shown that the active and total organic matter and levels of biological activity, they increase pretty consistently with total plant biomass production and the extent and duration of living roots and the soil coverage in terms of days per year. In other words, it was, I believe, either the Rodale one or the long-term study in Beltsville, Maryland, where there were two rotations, one managed organically and one conventionally. And because the conventional ones were giving slightly higher yields and slightly more stover because they received concentrated fertilizer, the two systems had the same biomass, but the organic system had more perennial roots because it was an alfalfa phase in the rotation. And the soil was covered by the living vegetation 3/4 of the year rather than approximately half of the year on average. And that made a big difference. And as a result, the organic system was accruing more soil organic matter and biological activity. So some basic practices: high biomass cover crops, the topic of the day, the perennial sod. That really is important because the root mass from these is much greater and is there over a much longer period of time without disturbance. And always keeping the orchard floor covered. We'll talk again a little bit more about that later. So in summary, this is kind of an equation I came up with based on, again, on a number of studies. Cover crops work in conjunction with other organic and sustainable practices, such as the use of appropriate amounts of compost and manure. Now that term appropriate is based a lot on a nutrient management consideration, especially phosphorus levels. But where you have enough phosphorus and you just want to add a little bit, that little bit has complementary benefits to soil life and soil health, so that the two together give you more organic matter and more other benefits such as soil structure and biological activity and nutrient turnover than either one alone. And then on top of that, you want to till with care. Here's an example of strip tillage where you're just preparing a narrow strip. And all those together give you good soil. Okay, we'll talk about a few examples here from the Western region. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Eric Brennan, who's on the line with us. And if I say anything that's way out of line here, just jump in and correct me while we're going or during the discussion period, either way. So Dr. Brennan was working in the Salinas Valley on an organic vegetable rotation. It was a fairly simple rotation that there was spring lettuce followed by fall broccoli. And then during the winter, this is in Central California, the ground was either fallowed or cover cropped. Now, if the ground is fallow, you got several really significant risks going on. You can lose a lot of nutrients to leaching or to denitrification, which produces nitrous oxide gas, a greenhouse gas that really don't want to be letting too much into the air. And there's also a risk of compaction or other soil degradation from having no cover during the winter rainy season. So what Dr. Brennan has been doing is experimenting with adding a winter cover crop of rye and legumes to plant after the broccoli and then grow through until it's time to plant lettuce. So what's happening here is you have nitrogen fixation, you also have nitrogen recovery, and it's restoring the soil organic matter. And this rotation, when the cover crop was grown every year, the spring lettuce consistently gave good yields in the neighborhood of 1,000 30-pound boxes per acre, just 30,000 pounds of fresh lettuce per acre, which I think is pretty excellent. And in the experimental system where the cover crop was grown only 1 year out of 4 and the ground was left fallow the other 3 years, even when compost was used, the lettuce yields tended to suffer. And if it got neither compost nor cover crop, it was pretty much of a yield loss on the lettuce, pretty much of a crop loss. The interesting thing is, you can, there's more detail in this video, it's a link to the video there that Dr. Brennan created. And interesting thing is, even when this was just rye by itself or crucifer, the lettuce yields were much better than without a cover crop, suggesting that nitrogen recovery was the main source of this benefit. And that's because broccoli is a nitrogen hog. You really got to load the nitrogen on to make it economically viable crop. And it's not super efficient, so there will be a significant amount of nitrogen left in the soil profile. And if the next year's lettuce can get that, it's going to do great. But the only way you can guarantee that in a super rainy winter is to have it all being recovered by a vigorous cover crop. Okay, we're jumping to a very dry part of the West. This is like the northern Great Plains, could also be interior parts of the Pacific Northwest where typical rainfall is 10, 12, 15 inches a year. The standard rotation that a lot of farmers use is a year of wheat or other cereal grain, and then a year of fallow, and then another year of wheat or another cereal grain, and then fallow. Where the winters are extremely cold, perhaps spring wheat, where the winters are a little more moderate, or there's good snow protection, very often winter wheat. But what happens is this whole year of fallow, like it's about a 13-month period where there's nothing on the ground. And during that time, you can get wind erosion, you definitely get loss of soil organic matter, and you lose the water holding capacity. So in the short term, this crop is getting 2 years worth of rainfall, and that is the rationale behind this rotation. However, in the long term, the capacity of this soil to hold that moisture is going down, down, down. In fact, wheat fallow rotations, even when managed with continuous no-till and either organic or very careful use, judicious use of conventional inputs, even in those circumstances, the wheat fallow rotation tends to show a loss of soil organic matter and a degradation of soil health. So the next step is to go ahead and put something, grow almost anything in that other year. And the big trade-off is that that crop is going to consume moisture. At the same time, it's going to rebuild soil organic matter and fertility. And you can either produce a production crop, you can run that buckwheat right to harvest and get a grain off of it, or you can terminate it as a green manure. Same with the field pea. So interesting study. There was a long-term study, and I didn't jot down where it was, but it was done somewhere in this general region. And over a period of 40 years, there was 4 treatments: pasture, a wheat pea rotation, continuous wheat. So all 4 of these years in this rotation would be wheat. You think, well, that's a monoculture. That's even worse than fallow. And then the 4th one was what we saw on the previous slide, was wheat fallow, wheat fallow. Well, at the end of that time, they checked out the microbial biomass, measured as soil microbial biomass carbon. The pasture, no surprise, won with over 1,000 parts per million, so in an acre with 1,000 tons of topsoil, that'd be a ton of microbial biomass carbon. The wheat pea rotation came out at 740. Well, that would be like 3/4 of a ton. Wheat was 504 parts per million, so that would be like a half a ton. And then wheat fallow was down at 280. In other words, the wheat fallow only had 1/4 of the biomass of the pasture and only 1/2, slightly over 1/2 the biomass of continuous wheat. So the big challenge here is, okay, how do we get this long-term benefit without leaving this wheat crop short of water because the pea used too much? Okay, so we'll go from very dry to very wet. I know I'm jumping back and forth here, but now we're back in Salinas in a different system. This one is organic strawberry. Strawberries, organic or not, are typically grown on these plastic mulch raised beds with a furrow or alley in between, which is typically bare. And this is based on my reading of one of Dr. Brennan's research reports in a referee journal. That this is a photo I took from that article, and it shows a severe ponding and runoff and some erosion after, I believe it was 4/10 of an inch of rain. It said 10 millimeters, and I think that's just 4/10, so that's not exactly a torrential rain. And we have all of this ponding. So Dr. Brennan's been looking at, well, what do we do? Let's grow a cover crop in the alley. And there it is, a mustard cover crop, planted pretty thick in the late winter or late fall, just after the strawberries were set out. And then in February, when this mustard gets a little taller than that, comes through with a weed whacker. So what this does is it provides a living cover during the period of heaviest rainfall in the winter in California. And that cover crop recovered about 22 pounds per acre of nitrogen, which is very handy. You consider it's just in the furrow. That's a pretty good performance. So it's definitely reducing nitrogen losses and certainly way cutting back on runoff and stopping erosion. Okay, so orchard floor management. Now we're looking at drier regions again. This is an irrigated orchard in Utah. There's one experiment where they tried bird's foot trefoil in the alleys between the trees, and then a low-growing, shallow-rooted cover crop called alyssum. It's related to mustard, and it's good for beneficial insects. And doesn't take a whole lot of moisture because it doesn't root very deeply. But these are pretty young trees, and it turns out you really need to keep the competition down around the young trees. And once they're established, they become a lot more tolerant of competition. Now, there are some orchards and vineyards that are managed where the entire orchard floor is kept bare, either with herbicides or with tillage. And a number of studies, both in the United States and the Western region and in Europe, have showed that if you do that, you will lose half your organic matter by the time the trees are mature, compared to keeping it covered. So this is an example out of a bulletin that ATRA put out on cover cropping for organic systems in the Western region. Here you got mature trees. They can stand a little competition. And in this case, they let everything grow up. It was a legume grass mixture in the alleys. And then there was just some grasses growing right up next to the trees. Then they just grazed the whole thing with sheep. So it's grazed down, but you have not disturbed the soil and you left the root mass in place and yet kept the competition down a little bit. So that's another good example of that. And going back to Utah, this is a project funded by the Organic Research and Extension Initiative. They were looking at trefoil, birdsfoot trefoil in alleys, and the mowings were blown into the rows. And this was found to really build the organic matter and enhanced not only microbial biomass and activity, but also root growth out into the alleys underneath that nice living mulch cover. And having the nitrogen in the clippings blown into the tree rows enhanced the tree crop nutrition. And interestingly enough, this system took no more irrigation water than herbicide fallow with the bare soil. So this is an example of a cover cropping strategy that did not have any water use costs. Now, this is a drip irrigated orchard. They're not growing those dryland on Utah's 5 or 10 inches of rain a year. So, but the good news is that they did not need more irrigation to keep the trees happy with that cover crop. Okay, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, or SARE program, has conducted a series of cover crop surveys, just surveying farmers all across the country and getting a sense of their view of cover crops and their experience with how the cover crops affect yield. Now, there are some cases where the cover crop has a yield cost and other cases where it seems to have a yield benefit and other cases where there's not much effect at all. But when 1,000 or more different farmers were interviewed each year, there was a small but statistically significant improvement in corn and soybean yields where cover crops were used as opposed to where they were not. In a drought year, 2012, it was a terrible drought, and that benefit jumped up to 10%. They did a survey on wheat one year, and that showed again a small increase in 2016. Another trend that was seen was that when farmers have been cover cropping for 4 years or more, the yield benefit was larger, like it would be 5 or 10% rather than just 1 or 2. As a result, farmer adoption of cover cropping is increasing, and they're reporting better soil health. 86% of farmers cited visible improvements in soil health even within a couple of years of doing the cover cropping. Easier weed control, less development of herbicide resistance. Now, this is not organic, but there'll be a few organic farmers included in it. But there was help with weed control and the yield stability as noted above. And in 2016, there are a lot of farmers who are planting mixes, which gives you that diversity advantage. And a quarter of them were interseeding cover crops into standing cash crops. And we'll see in a moment why that can be really important in some situations faced by Western region growers. One thing I want to point out is that there were only a few growers from the Western region participating in this survey. They were a small minority. However, looking in the westernmost part of the north central region, Nebraska and the Dakotas, where climates are not that different from Montana in terms of drought and challenges of limited rainfall, the trends in cover and crop response to the cover crops was not that different. So again, at the very least, you had stable crop yields with obvious improvements in soil health. So in short, does cover cropping pay? You do have to think about the costs as well as the benefits. You're going to spend $30 to $70 per acre getting the seed and getting them planted. And then you have the whole thing of how are you going to terminate it? Are you going to need new equipment because you want to do a certain kind of termination method? And then there's the fuel and labor of just taking care of it, managing it. Indirect costs, if you're adding a cover crop and it's resulting in a cash crop not being planted or a later planting, you will have a yield trade-off or income forgone. But there are some really important cost offsets. if you're growing a cover crop that contains legume component and you're reducing your fertilizer needs by 50 pounds per acre, if you're an organic grower and using something like feather meal, you'll be saving $200 to $250 on the fertilizer you didn't need to add. And then you will have savings on weed control if the cover crop is helping with weed pressure. And in the long term, you will get that improved soil moisture holding capacity, so you will not have to irrigate as frequently or as much. So the way to minimize these costs, especially this income foregone, is to say, first of all, are there any fallow periods where my soil is just sitting there bare and at risk? Put the cover crop in then, and you won't be foregoing income because you're not supplanting a cash crop. And this change from fallow to cover crop is going to have the greatest impact on the soil health and soil conservation in your system. I mean, if you've got a tight rotation already and you take one of them out, put a cover crop in, you will get some improvement because the cover crop will return more biomass to the soil than a vegetable crop. But if you've got a rotation that has fallow, either winter or another time of the year, that's where you have your real big difference from doing the cover crop. Okay, well, let's look at a few challenges in a little bit more depth here. The first one is selecting the cover crop. And this is true anywhere in the country. You've got to consider a whole lot of factors. You know, what are your goals and what part of the rotation? What is the planting date and the termination date that you need to fit it in? What is the climate and the season that you're trying to fit it in? Rainfall patterns. This is a real challenge in the West. Soil conditions and your overall production system, and what tools you have on hand. If you already have a roller crimper, well, you can terminate by roll crimping if it gives you sufficient control. So cover crop traits. There's the plant family, their growth habit, root mass and depth, the seasonal life cycle. Like if you are growing a winter cover crop, you probably don't want to choose buckwheat because it'll winter kill before it gives you much biomass. You look at the nitrogen fixation and the carbon to nitrogen ratio, both in terms of is the cover crop going to add nitrogen to your system? And if so, is it going to release it too quickly or too slowly for your next crop? Nutrient recovery plays into this too. And then you want to consider the cover crop's resistance to drought and cold and other stresses that'll occur with the season. Just some specific examples of selection. Suppose your cash crop is broccoli, and that is a heavy feeder for nitrogen, or sweet corn or field corn. Those are good examples that you need a lot of nitrogen. So you might want to have a crop that's heavy in nitrogen fixation, one that's mostly legume beforehand, or at least partially legume. And then after the crop is done, especially broccoli, as we saw, leaves a lot of nitrogen. You want a nitrogen scavenger, something that's going to be able to soak up the nitrogen that was left behind. On the other hand, if your cash crop is edamame soybean or lima bean or something like that, or just regular old feed grade soybean, they are very strong nitrogen fixers, and you might do just as well with a nitrogen immobilizing cover crop such as this rye. Because the rye, once you roll crimp it or otherwise terminate it, it's going to suppress a lot of the weeds that respond to nitrogen. And then meanwhile, the soybean is able to fix the nitrogen it needs and will not be held back by the low soil nitrogen levels. Okay, we'll just quickly go through some examples of different goals and what you might look for to meet those goals. If you want to build organic matter and maintain tilth, maintain the crumb structure, there's nothing like a dense fibrous root system like this Italian ryegrass to maintain that. Pretty much all of the grasses will have this fibrous root system, and so that just about the entire soil volume down to at least a foot will be receiving a daily injection of those root exudates, and the biological activity resulting will continue to regenerate crumb structure. But for really best results, it's good to mix the grass with a legume or another succulent broadleaf because that actually gives the soil life a more balanced diet, if you will, and then the soil life is even healthier and you get enhanced aggregation. Feeding soil life and building up that functional diversity, nothing like a good mix. A grass legume biculture, which is relatively not too challenging to manage. When you're getting up with these 6, 8, 10 species mixes, it can be challenging to, in practice, to plant them, because you'll need different seed sizes, require different hoppers. You might have to do a couple of passes, etc. One thing to keep aware of is you want some mycorrhizal hosts in your mix. Now, all the legumes and all of the grasses in the cover crops catalog is going to be good, strong mycorrhizal hosts. The buckwheat and the crucifers are not. So if you had a cover crop that was dominated by those, you may have a decrease in the levels of these valuable fungi. But if you have a little bit of buckwheat or crucifers mixed in, and you have grass and legume as well, you will be supporting that function. The legumes, of course, support the nitrogen fixation, and as I said earlier, each species is going to bring its own suite of beneficial organisms. So breaking up hardpan, retrieving leached nitrogen, they kind of go together, deep roots. Cover crops, most of them have a capacity to get through at least a moderate hardpan. Even winter rye, which is not nearly as deep and heavy rooted as this pearl millet and Sudan grass and tillage radish, even the rye will open up the soil profile on some soils and allow the next crop to send its roots deeper. And other examples are canola, alfalfa, sweet clover, and sorghum Sudan grass. And the caveat, again, is when you got these deep roots, is you do have to pay attention to soil moisture utilization, and we will look at that later in a little bit more depth. Optimizing nutrients. Again, the legumes fix nitrogen, and the grains and grasses recover nitrogen that's already in the soil. The neat thing about putting a mix together is it's almost like you've got a little built-in precision farming, precision agriculture here, because what happens is, suppose your soil is a little variable, like parts of your field have lots of nitrate left and enough that they're going to wash away if it rains too much. And some parts are low in nitrate, so low that maybe the next crop is going to suffer some nitrogen limitation. Well, if you have rye and legume, or if you have a grass and a legume growing together, wherever the soil is rich in nitrogen, the grass is going to suck it up and is probably going to dominate. You won't see that much of the legume. And wherever the soil is short in nitrogen, the grass is going to grow slower, and the legume is going to start fixing as much nitrogen as it possibly can. So you'll have a leveling effect. And another thing that's really cool is that if your phosphorus and potassium levels test low on the soil test, it just means they're not available. Usually, if you were to do a total nutrient analysis, a total mineral analysis, you will find sufficient amounts of those, but they're locked up. Well, legumes and buckwheat are really good at unlocking phosphorus, and grasses are really good at unlocking potassium from mineral complexes. You have a deep-rooted grass, you could have a soil that shows very low topsoil potassium, but the grass is going to be able to get all the potassium it needs, and then it's going to return it to the topsoil when you terminate it. Preventing erosion, suppressing weeds. These kind of go together because the more coverage you have on the surface, the faster it closes, the fewer rains are likely to pose a risk of erosion, and the less the weeds will have any chance to get through. Now, this is an interesting picture because I made a mistake when I planted the trial, of which that cowpea was a part. I saw it looked like a clean seed bed, and I got out there with my little push seeder and planted all these little mini plots, you know, like 5 by 20, which you can do with an earthway, and thought, great, and have great cover crops. Well, every cover crop came up weedy as can be, except this one. That's because the seed bed was made 5 days earlier. The weeds were there, just about to break the surface. They were in the white. They were already germinated. So most of the cover crops I tried, the other summer legumes and the sorghum Sudan and the pearl millet, were just a little too slow to overwhelm those weeds that had the 5-day jump on them. But the cowpea formed a canopy so quickly that there was almost no weeds. Another thing is when you combine 2 different cover crops or more, again, the diversity, with different architecture. Here we've got oats, which are tall and straight, and then peas, which are climbing, and have more broadleaf type of growth habit. That hastens canopy closure, and it more thoroughly occupies a niche so that the weeds don't have a chance. Again, you get a torrential rain on either of these, you might flatten the cover crop, but you're not going to lose any soil. So a couple of other fast-growing ones, radish, most of the grain. Sorghum Sudan is really good. And again, I said mixing the tall grasses with a spreading or climbing legume gives you that canopy closure. Your goal could be for harboring natural enemies of pests. So you just want plants like buckwheat or phacelia and flower that have available pollen and nectar for the adult phases, like this soldier beetle, whose larvae like to eat cucumber beetles and other pests. Okay, so some cover crops for challenging soils. Your soil is cool and wet, Japanese millet, annual ryegrass, oats, and there's one that I also heard is Alside clover that can work in that. I'm not sure if it's used that often in the West, but here's Japanese millet that can help deal with a situation like this, where you got weeds that tolerate the wet soil, and that's about all it's growing on the side on the left. If your soil is just generally low fertility, sun hemp and pearl millet. I saw a field once that was so infertile that even soybeans that had their seeds inoculated didn't grow well. And yet the sun hemp was almost of normal height. It was 5 feet tall, dark green, looked great. Sorghum Sudan grass was a disaster. Pearl millet did pretty well. Cowpea is also quite tolerant, as is buckwheat. Low pH, again, a lot of the same ones. Also, oats, rye, and vetch are quite tolerant. Now, for alkaline soils, barley and most of the crucifers can deal with that pH up around 8 pretty well. Now, there's a few other challenges that can come up with cover cropping. And one is you just got to make sure you got good seed and good planting method. Or you're going to end up with a weedy cover crop or maybe even a crop failure. Now, this is a very vigorous soybean, but not very many that came up because the seed wasn't very good. So it's about 2/3 soybeans and 1/3 weeds. Termination is a big challenge. If you till, you're going to risk losing some of your benefits and maybe even burning out some organic matter or risking wind erosion. If you don't till, and you have an organic system, you do have the risk of more weed pressure. And then again, and this is something you can manage by selecting your mix, doing a legume and a grass. So if the legume by itself and terminate it, especially plow it down, till it in, spade it in, may release some nitrogen too fast and you lose it before your next crop can use it. If you've got a mature cereal just by itself, it will tie up the nitrogen. So, all right, now back to some issues that are specific to the West. A maritime Mediterranean climate. We got lots of rain in the winter and not much in the summer. If you try to plant early in the fall and the rains haven't started yet, you may have a hard time getting that crop to come up. But if you plant late in the season, and this often happens because your summer crop goes well into the fall. Like if you don't have frost until like November, you might be harvesting tomatoes until November. And meanwhile, the rains have started and it gets very hard to get into the field to plant at all. And sometimes you manage to mud them in, but they're not coming up that well and the weeds get a head start. All of these are great winter cover crops for a maritime Mediterranean climate if you can get them in on time. One strategy that researchers at Oregon State, Nick Andrews and others have been working with is interplanting the cover crops into the cash crop. And Pennsylvania State has developed a seeder, it's a drill that plants between the rows. So that's very handy. Here's some good examples. Here's some legumes that are just coming up in a triple row of kale. This is an eggplant crop that's long spent. It had its first frost. It was overseeded with a cereal grain. I think it's oats. So it's well established there. So no bare soil there. I mean, the season's over, but you got a nice cover crop. Again, here the winter squash was overseeded with red clover, and the same result. You got a nice cover crop even at harvest time. So in the dryland, the challenges are different. Basically, you got a rotation. You got your cover crop, you got your grain crop, and as always, you got weeds. They're all vying for soil moisture. And when there's not much of it around, the grain crop can really get shortchanged. So the other thing that happens is because of this limitation is that the cover crop itself is not as able to produce a lot of biomass, and you can suffer from weed pressure in both the cover and the cash crop. And so that is why farmers in these very limited rainfall regions will often have something of a fallow period. Now, if you have an extended fallow period, the dryland soils are especially prone to these forms of degradation, the wind erosion, the loss of organic matter, and reduction in fertility. The soils are inherently more fragile, and when there's no cover and that strong wind comes up, it can be really bad. Okay, so some cover crops. Pearl millet is one that's done very well. This is actually a photograph from New Mexico State University Extension. And interestingly enough, the winter field pea, I used to think of this as something that needed a lot of moisture and could stand up to quite a bit of cold. We grow it here in Virginia all the time, and that's actually was a photo from Virginia. But I have read fairly consistent results in a number of reports of studies from the Northern Great Plains, from the interior Pacific Northwest, that this is one of the best cover crops to put into that fallow year. It combines drought tolerance, good biomass, fair amount of nitrogen fixation, and a relatively low demand on soil moisture. And again, one of the things to do is to terminate the cover crop, hopefully in a way that you leave the residue on the surface, and then that residue cover can remain in place during the summer before you then go into your next winter wheat planting. So this is a table that I made up based on a chart, a cover crop chart that the USDA produced for the Northern Great Plains. So we've got two dimensions here, and you got low to high of drought resistance. That's how much drought can this crop stand up to and still look good and still grow. And then what is its water usage? That can also go from low to high. So we have up here a set of cover crops that are highly recommended for these semi-arid region rotations, especially when you're trying to do something better than wheat fallow, and you've got to put something in that year that's not going to rob you blind for moisture. The medics, barley, pearl millet, cowpea, and phacelia, which is interesting to me because pearl millet has tremendously deep roots, and yet it is apparently sufficiently efficient in its use of moisture that it does not drain the soil profile. Sun hemp and sorghum are kind of intermediate, and that also includes sorghum Sudan grass. And over here, we have alfalfa, which is its roots are famously deep. There's one report of them going as deep as 49 feet. Typical is 10 to 15 feet. And a long-term perennial alfalfa crop will sap all the moisture out of that. And there's some studies at Montana State that led their extension to warn organic growers not to use alfalfa sod as part of their rotation if they're going back into annual crops. Because when they break that sod and the soil is bone dry, about the only thing that'll grow is drought-resistant weeds. Sunflower and safflower also. Now, these are good oilseed crops, so if you're growing them to make as part of your cash crop production regime, they can be good crops to grow, but you got to be aware of their high water use. Rye and triticale are also pretty heavy water users, as is radish, not as drought tolerant. And then you can just see some here. Oats, faba bean, and buckwheat are known to be have very poor drought tolerance and will only be good really during seasons when there's adequate moisture. So a few lesser known cover crops that I became familiar with as I did my research for this webinar. NRCS in Lockford, California, a couple of investigators with their team looked at a series of cover crops for the California Central Valley and identified two that did amazingly well. Now, this was a situation. It's in this part of the Central Valley. It doesn't get that much rain. It's a fairly dry Mediterranean climate. So there was this one winter where they pre-irrigated. They did irrigate once, a couple of inches of moisture right before planting in the fall. I think they planted in November. Yeah, they irrigated October, planted November, and they planted triticale, Braco white mustard, Cucamonga California brome, and then also something called Blando soft brome. And then there was a barrel medic. All of these are known to be fairly drought tolerant. And what happened is these two, which are both shown here in the mixture, the Cucamonga brome and the Braco white mustard, even though there was no rain from the time of planting essentially until February, only a half an inch, and then a decent amount of rain in February, March, about 5.5 inches. On that very limited amount of additional rainfall, they generated over around 11,000 pounds per acre of biomass. This is what was reported. And the triticale did pretty well too. It generated 8,000, and to its credit, it actually left the most soil moisture. The soil moisture level was highest in April after the triticale. Blando brome produced less biomass, and the medic largely failed, and there was a substantial amount of weeds. Whereas with these two cover crops, there was 0 weeds. And a few, again, going back to that USDA cover crop chart, a few interesting species: Russian wild rye, various wheat grasses, and something called alkali grass. Very high drought and salt tolerance. So of interest for growers in drier regions. Okay, let's look at the Northern Great Plains again. This is some studies by Montana State. This is a Western SARE funded study that included field trials and a farmer survey. And what they found is that having the cover crops in the rotation was important, not only for the nitrogen from the legumes, but from a rotation effect. The wheat did much better after growing after something in a different plant family than growing after wheat or after fallow. Again, winter pea was emerged as one of the best choices. And then tips based on these studies for Northern Great Plains is you want to plant early in the fall, if at all practical. Now, the Northern Great Plains, their limited rainfall is fairly distributed around the year, so sometimes you'll be lucky and get a decent rainfall sometime in the fall and get that cover crop up. You want to terminate at early bloom. Don't grow it till it's tough. You don't want to grow it too close to when you're planting the next wheat crop. This limits the soil moisture drawdown. Again, winter pea worked really well for nitrogen, water efficiency, and the subsequent grain. This is the wheat that's grown after the pea, and you want to avoid the water hogs like alfalfa. Okay, this is some of the trials. When the cover crops were grown in the spring and terminated in the summer, they grew well and suppressed weeds, but they depleted not only soil moisture, but nitrate nitrogen, so that grain yields were significantly reduced, typically by about 25%. Now, they went to an earlier planting. This is some on-farm trials, and then in the field station trials, they planted a little early and terminated a little earlier. And that actually increased the cover crop biomass. And it also reduced the moisture depletion and grain yield costs. And the interesting thing about the winter pea versus the multi-species mix, most of these are very highly diverse mixes, but they did winter pea by itself, and it performed similarly and actually supported higher grain protein production. This is a farmer's survey. Only about 30% of the farmers use cover crops, but given the extremely challenging environments of growing on 10 inches of rain, that is actually pretty encouraging that many were using them already. Half of them are using mixes. Most of them plan to continue cover cropping because they see the soil health benefits. They also found some of them they can use the cover crops for grazing and also observe the benefit in terms of nitrogen. A few of them are considering stopping because of direct costs and, no surprise there, the water use concerns. Okay, now we'll move over to the Pacific Northwest, interior, northeast Washington. There was a conservation innovation grant project funded through the Okanagan Conservation District area with about 11 inches of precipitation per year, not that dissimilar from Montana, but most of it comes as winter snow. The summers are bone dry. The soils are not as good either as in the northern Great Plains, shallow and stony. So their control treatment was the winter wheat fallow, and they tried various cover crop regimes. This time, planting in the fall and terminating the spring, like what was recommended in Montana, planting early spring and going up to July, or planting late spring and going into July of the fallow year. Very interesting findings because of this peculiar pattern of the, it is kind of a Mediterranean climate, except it's all snow in the winter and very limited amount of moisture. Sun hemp, which is really an ace here in the South, great for drought and heat tolerance, it actually did rather poorly in this environment. Perhaps it was just too dry, or maybe not enough warmth, because it is fairly northern, cool climate. Rye and vetch, they found that those self-seeded and became weeds. The field pea, no, not surprisingly, outperformed fava bean, which is not drought tolerant, but cowpea as well, another one of my favorites here in the Southeast for dry summers. You know, what we call a dry summer. You guys would laugh at me. But yeah, again, thought to be great drought heat tolerant, but they are not really, don't work in this environment. Very interesting finding. Even with the May to July planting, the field pea did quite well. And some other interesting things is the fall plantings in this environment failed. And that's not really surprising when you think about how dry the soil is. So unlike the maritime high rainfall Mediterranean climates where you would try to mud the seeds in and they get overwhelmed by weeds, here, the drought tolerant weeds had the jump on them because they would sit in that dry soil and not germinate for some weeks or even until spring. The spring plantings gave the best cover crops. Another thing that I found fascinating is that whereas the normal seeding rates that NRCS recommends for most environments, you want to aim for 30 or 40 seeds of the cover crop total per square foot. But it was found that you want to go around 12 to 14 seeds per square foot. I think that the formula that was given was 12 seeds if you have 10 inches of rain, and then add a seed for every additional inch of rain per year, or melted snow. And that's because when you seed it thicker, the plants compete with each other so much for water and nutrients that they just don't grow well. You actually have less biomass from a 30 seed per square foot planting than from a 12 seed. The wheat yields in these 4 years of trials on 20 farms, they varied all the way from severe reduction, 34%, all the way up to over a significant yield increase of 22%. Now, on average, that was about a 10% yield cost, 10 to 15%, very wide range. And it turns out that what was critical was the depth to moisture at the time of wheat planting. Not so much total soil moisture in the profile, but how deep you had to go to get to enough moisture to germinate a seed. If that was less than 4 inches, the grain drill could place that wheat seed in moisture and it would come up. Wheat being fairly drought tolerant, it can come up in a little bit of moisture, get its roots down and get established. But once that moisture was below 4 inches, you had severe problems with establishment and considerable yield drop. Again, terminating the cover crop a little early at 10% bloom gave the best results. It reduced moisture depletion. And one of the tricks that was recommended is to have farmers take soil cores during the cover crops to see when it was beginning to use too much moisture and it was time to get out there and terminate it. Okay, well, how do you terminate cover crop when you're limited moisture? Now, I've never seen one of these implements in person, but the more I've read about them and looked at both research reports and extension bulletins, I am highly impressed. This is probably the most valuable tool in the West when it comes to conservation, agriculture, organic agriculture, cover crop management. It's a blade plow or sweep plow undercutter. It just undercuts everything right below the soil surface. You end up with a, you take out the root crowns of the cover crops and all the weeds. You leave all that wonderful organic residue on the surface, and you leave 90% of the soil profile and its root mass undisturbed. Knocks out weeds. You get a high wind after this, you're not going to lose nearly the soil as you would if you had gone through that with a disc. And in fact, a little bit out of the region, but not too far out in western Nebraska, there was a study with sweet plow undercutter versus a regular disc harrow for terminating a spring planted cover crop of mustard and legumes ahead of corn or soybean. What happens when they took this implement to the cover crop, soybean and corn yields increased by 23 and 17% compared to the no cover crop control just with a winter fallow. But if the cover crop was disked in, the soybean had a 14% yield loss because the disc compacted the soil, did more damage to soil structure, and accelerated moisture loss. And there was another study in the Pacific Northwest on the effects of this implement versus standard tillage on wind erosion. And no surprise that wind erosion losses were much less with this particular tool. So I just want to mention a few resources real quickly, and then we can open it up for questions. So of course, SARE has a cover crop manual that's available, that applies to the whole nation. There's another one, Crop Rotation in Organic Farms, a planning manual. Now, granted, this one was written in the Northeast, so there'll be some general principles to glean from that, not as much specifics that applies to the West. But there's a learning center topic room on cover crops, a lot of excellent information for all parts of the country. Everything from the, includes the annual farmer surveys, decision tools, and other resources. More national resources, cover cropping for organic systems, topic area right here on the eOrganic website, and of course the webinars and videos. Then this USDA cover crop chart, which is developed for the Northern Great Plains area. I've mentioned that several times. Great information, a lot on drought tolerance, some on salt tolerance, and moisture use. These two together are very important for growers in the West. And then resources specific to the Western region. I borrowed some photos and some other information from this. Is by Rex Dufour at National Center for Appropriate Technology, the ATRA program. This is a cover crop and organic fertilizer calculator for Oregon State, most applicable to maritime Pacific Northwest, but also they have some another calculator for east of the Cascades or drier regions. Oregon State has a number of bulletins on cover crops, including some good information on integrating cover crops into vegetables and finding that niche. Soil nutrient management or organic farms, grain farms in Montana, a lot of good cover crop information there. Now the URL on that, I couldn't fit it on this slide, but it's in the lecture, the presentation notes. This was an excellent webinar that I attended, and that was the basis of some of the information I presented on challenges of dryland wheat in the Eastern Washington. Here's one I just found recently out of New Mexico State Extension. I didn't find as much information on in the dry southwestern part of the country, but this is a very good bulletin that comes from that part of the region. And another cover crop chart modeled a lot on the one that I showed for Northern Great Plains, but specifically for California. And that also provides a lot of information. In each region has, at this point, has a cover crops council, which is in the North Central. It's an excellent resource, very, very thorough, very extensive website. Northeast and South are creating websites and have built up a council. There is a Western Cover Crop Council in formation. It doesn't yet have a website or resources developed, but it is coming down. It's coming soon. So I want to thank the Western SARE region and for an Organic Farming Research Foundation for making this webinar possible, and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mark. We're going to start our question and answer period. So if you have a question, you can just type it into the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll be reading them out loud until we run out of time in the next half hour. If you don't see the Q&A box, you should be able to hover over your screen, and there's a black bar at the bottom with some controls, and that ought to pull it up. I also want to mention that we have been recording this presentation, and you'll be able to find the recording along with the slides and the presentation notes, which Mark mentioned, which has additional information at that link that I just put up on your screen where it says find the recording. And there's also a link on that page to all the webinars in this series that have been done so far, the upcoming webinars, and the slide handouts. So I'm just going to leave these links up during the Q&A. Moving on to the questions. We have a number of people that have already been typing questions. One person wants to know how you feel about cover crops being simply cut and allowed to lie without being tilled in. And sort of the second part of that question is, you've referred to roll crimping. So is there a benefit to simply laying down the cover crop versus mowing it down and letting it lie? So by the way, also Eric Brennan is on the line. So Eric, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in at any moment.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll let you take answer that one from the Western region viewpoint. I just want to say that roll crimping orients the residue so that if you're trying to do a mechanical no-till planting, it usually is much easier to deal with, unless you have a very finely chopped flail mode residue. Again, the roll crimping, one of the other advantages is that it has much less fuel consumption than the flail mower. You have anything to add, Eric, on that?
Yeah, so one of the challenges in our systems, so I'm in Salinas, California, and hi to everybody out there who's listening in. One of the challenges with leaving material on the surface for us would be trying to get good weed control. So, our systems here in Salinas, we produce a lot of small seeded vegetables, and even when we use transplanted vegetables, if there's a lot of residue there, that can create some challenges with trying to get adequate weed control, especially in organic systems. And so while we'd like to move towards minimizing tillage and leaving some of the residues on the surface, there are some real practical challenges with that. So that just from a weed control standpoint, a few other issues from other pests that may be a challenge would be, we have a lot of gophers here. If there's a lot more residue on the surface, gophers are a little bit harder to detect. From a fertility standpoint, if you've had a cover crop, like say when Mark was talking about that rotation that we have in our long-term trial where we do lettuce first in the spring, followed by broccoli, and then we either have a fallow winter or cover crops. If we didn't till that cover crop in after it's grown well, and I'd be concerned about the lack of nutrients from that cover crop cycling back into the next, the following lettuce crop as quickly as if the material's tilled in. And I understand over time there may be there's obviously going to be some movement of those nutrients down in through decomposition, but I believe a lot of the benefits that we see from cover crops in our vegetable systems has to do with the nutrients in the cover crop material being released relatively quickly and hopefully in synchrony with our vegetable nutrient needs. And so if we're not incorporating that material back in, the release dynamics will be quite delayed. This doesn't mean that we're not trying to move in the direction of reducing tillage, but there's just a lot of practical challenges. And, these are intensive systems here where the farmers are under pretty strong economic pressure to produce quite a bit. And so I'm not quite sure that we're going to be able to move into a no-till system anytime soon, but we're definitely trying to reduce tillage in these systems.
Hey, regarding weed suppression, does that include perennial weeds such as bindweeds when you're talking about cover crop benefits?
Should I answer that, Mark, or do you want to?
Yeah, go for it. I haven't tried it on hedge bindweed, which is our variant here, so go for it.
Yeah, so in our systems, we tend not to have a lot of perennial weeds in the Salinas area because we're so tillage intensive. I will say, however, that we are starting to get a little bit of it coming up, like in our long-term study, which began in 2003. So it's right now I think it's in its 16th year. The first 8 years of the study were, excuse me, 2 vegetables a year rotated then with either fallow or cover crops. We didn't see any field bindweed at all. But then we went into a year of strawberries, which is very tillage intensive at the beginning of the season in October when we plant the strawberries. But then there's basically very little tillage through the rest of the strawberry season for a full year. We then did actually start seeing a little bit of field bindweed pop up in our long-term study, and that really scared me actually, because field bindweed in organic systems can be a nightmare. And there's a little video that if you want to check out where I talk about some of this challenge, and if what I'm concerned about is if that gets worse over time and we can't control it, we're going to be really kind of stuck. But because our systems tend to be relatively tillage intensive, perennial weeds are not as much of an issue as the annual weeds are.
This is Mark. I just want to add something real quick. I'm aware of how severe a challenge this bindweed is. The good news is there is an OREI-funded project, Organic Research and Extension Initiative, that is looking at integrated organic bindweed management, and they're using biological controls. There's a bindweed gall mite, and then there's a bindweed moth, and they both show promise for really weakening the weed. And combined with diverse rotation and timely tillage, they are seeing some positive indication that you don't have to beat the soil to death with tillage in order to keep up with it. But this is very much in a research phase, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the results over the coming years.
No, that sounds exciting. One thing I should mention is that if you're interested in seeing the video where I mentioned our concerns about field bindweed, if you go to YouTube and you search for a video channel, just look up the keywords Brennan, my last name, and organic. The video where I discuss this is titled something like what our organic gardens taught us about the challenges of organic regulations. So that's the video that I did with a colleague, Michelle Cavagelli, talking about some perennial weed concerns.
Okay. Mark, this is going back to the surveys that you talked about where farmers were reporting benefits from soil health from using cover crops. So we have somebody who wanted to know, when they report that they had better soil health from cover crops, what is it that they're talking about and how do they measure that?
I'd have to go back and read the details of the report. I would imagine it's fairly obvious things like the soil is easier to work, it's a little darker, there's more earthworms, crops are more resilient, they don't wilt so quickly during a dry spell. There are a number of fairly easily observable macroscopic indicators of soil health. I mean, the most obvious, I think, is how easily does it get compacted? I mean, does it form an iron-hard crust after one medium-sized thunderstorm, or does it stay relatively workable through various weather extremes? But the crop resilience is another one that you can usually tell when your soil is healthy if your crops continue to grow well without a whole lot of inputs or effort.
If I might just kind of chime in,
Sure.
that's a great point, Mark. In our long-term study, we have done some measurements of somewhat common measures of soil health, such as microbial biomass carbon and things like that, which are relatively complicated to measure. But the great thing is that our measures of those things usually correlated very well with how our crops were yielding, how our vegetables were yielding. So as much as I'm interested in these more complicated ways of measuring microbial or soil health, microbial attributes as well as some other physical ones, I think what's really great is that in most cases, from what I've seen, our vegetable crops are an indication of whether or not we've got a healthy soil. And I liked what you said there about how a healthy system is one where you don't have to put maybe as much in. And in our systems, we found we're getting great yields with relatively low fertilizer inputs, organic fertilizer inputs, when we use a cover crop regularly. But
Yeah.
when we use the exact same amount of fertilizer inputs, but we have frequent winter fallows, our systems tend not to yield near as much vegetable. And, you know, that's a pretty obvious indication that those are less healthy systems.
Mhm.
We can also crawl through on our hands and knees. I often tell people you could blindfold me and put me in a plot, and I could probably tell you what treatment I was in just based on the size of the clods that I could pick up. It's pretty interesting where you have bigger clods, very hard soil conditions in the plots that we don't frequently cover crop.
Okay.
Yeah,
We have a couple. Oh, sorry.
yeah,
Sure.
very quickly, I want to add that the NRCS recently issued a draft technical note on recommended laboratory procedures for various soil health measures. Two that show a lot of promise are one based on a Solvita test. It's a soil respiration test, indicator of microbial activity, and also very closely correlated with how quickly organic matter is turning over and releasing plant nutrients. Like you'd find high microbial activity after tilling down that cover crop that fed the lettuce crops in Dr. Brennan's work. And the other measure is permanganate oxidizable carbon, or POXC. It's a little more complicated procedure, but I believe they're developing kits now that you can use in the field. And that one, even though that is a form of active organic matter, it also correlates pretty well with how effectively the soil life is building stable organic matter. So those two actually complement each other. They're both indicators of microbial activity, but they indicate the two distinct important functions of the soil life. One is to build up the long-term organic matter and sequester carbon, and the other is to continually churn over through respiration the active organic matter so that the crops are nourished. There are other measures that they're looking at. One is the microbial biomass carbon, and there's a few others. And I'm really looking forward to the final technical note. It was posted for public comment for a while at the end of the last year. Okay, that's enough on that.
Okay. We have a couple listeners from the Pacific Northwest asking for some recommendations. And one of them was wondering about cover crops with a tolerance for wet saturated soil, specifically in Western Washington.
I did mention that the Italian or annual ryegrass is fairly tolerant. I believe oats can deal with a bit of wet conditions. And there was that Alsai clover. Also, the Japanese millet. Now, that one you have to be a little careful with because it can become a weed if it sets seed. And the other thing is it is not frost tolerant, so you'd have to plant it after your spring frost date. But if you want an early spring cover crop that tolerates somewhat wet soils, that is one. Or you could also plant it in the fall and let it winter kill, and then you'd have a mulch in place.
Okay, how about a winter annual self-reseeding legume for irrigated orchard and vineyards in the semi-arid Pacific Northwest, like the Okanagan Valley, other than hairy vetch?
I'll let you take a crack at that one, Eric. And also, if you have any more on the wet soil ones, I'd be interested to hear what you have on that.
I don't have much to say about that one. That's well, let's see. Regarding the self-seeding one, I really don't have enough experience to suggest something on that. I would, if I was a grower in that situation, I would probably try to contact, you know, a local extension person or somebody at NRCS in that area. Regarding what to do in wet conditions, we generally don't have a problem with that here, but what I know does not work well are brassicas. Mustard cover crops do terribly in our furrows if we don't have the field, if we have field conditions where you get puddling and, you know, excessive puddling and lack of drainage in those furs. So the picture that you showed of our where there was all that runoff coming out of that field, luckily in those situations that field will drain down. Unfortunately, we lose a lot of soil in the process when we don't have a cover crop there. But if we have a mustard in there and the field has got low spots, then the mustard won't grow well there. So mustard can handle having wet feet, but we generally don't have a problem with overly wet conditions in our systems that don't have plastic mulch.
One thing I would add on the self-seeding, I would look into crimson clover because it self-seeds very easily. And in fact, I've had trouble. I was doing one experiment with some colleagues at Virginia Tech, and we ran into trouble one year when the clover self-seeded and competed with the summer squash. And right next door, the hairy vetch and rye was roll crimped at just the right time. We had a great squash crop.
Okay, here's a question from someone who's certified organic and would like to use a drought-tolerant alfalfa in several fields for 2 years to compete with the weeds and have significant nitrogen fixation. What would be the best management practices for that?
And where's the location again? I'm sorry, I missed that.
They didn't say. So, Timothy, if you would like to let us know where you are, type it into the chat or the question box, and we'll do our best here. Let's see. Okay, we'll just give him.
While you're waiting on that,
Yeah.
one thought I have, I don't have much experience with alfalfa, but
Denver. Okay, Denver, Colorado.
One of the papers that I have read talks about using a nurse crop like a small grain like oats to help establish the alfalfa so that you can minimize weed challenges. But I would check with somebody locally and see what they're doing, because from what I understand, because alfalfa's small seeded, it can be challenging to get a good stand if you're not careful.
I don't know what the water limitations are like there compared to Montana. Maybe not quite as severe, but I do know there's that concern. If you look for the most drought-tolerant alfalfa, maybe the one with the deepest, most extensive root system, it would suck all the moisture out of the soil profile. But if you're getting sufficient rain between terminating the alfalfa and when you put your next crop in, you will need some form of tillage to terminate that crop with that huge, heavy taproot. The sweet plow undercutter may do the job, but I'm not for sure on that. Equipment is not one of my areas of expertise.
Okay, yeah, he said he's in Denver, Colorado, and uses drip irrigation.
Oh, you are on drip irrigation. Probably that would ease the issue of the alfalfa water consumption. And in terms of managing it, in terms of terminating it, I'm not sure. I think that's something I already have the answer to.
Okay.
I'll actually add a link right there after Timothy's question about the alfalfa. I'll paste in the citation that I was mentioning about the oat as a companion crop with the alfalfa.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you could do that in the chat box and copy all the attendees, that would be great. Let's see, I'm just going through here to the questions. Okay, Dr. Brennan says they use intense tillage, and I think this is the same person who asked well, let's see, I'm trying to remember if no, it's not the same person as the bindweed question, it's a different one. Dr. Brennan says they use intense tillage, and Mark suggests shallow tilling to 3 inches. Can Dr. Brennan suggest the depth that he feels is beneficial for integrating organic matter from cover crops back into the soil?
Boy, you guys have tough questions, don't you?
We got good questioners here.
Yeah, no, this is good. Well, I'll tell you what we do in our area typically, and we can, whether or not it's beneficial or not, we can talk about that. In our region, when you're growing, say, a crop like broccoli, one of the biggest challenges as you approach the harvest date is that you need to keep the field relatively wet so that when the harvest crew comes through, the crowns are in a good shape to be harvested. The problem with that is that you get a very heavy trailer that's on the harvest rig going through the field, and that can create some ruts that are, a foot below the bottom, a foot below the initial depth of the furrow between the beds. So incredible compaction challenges can result from that. As a result, we often, after a broccoli crop, will have to let our field dry down a fair bit and then come through with a ripper, which this is when I say intense tillage, I mean real deep tillage down to about 3 feet, and try to break up compaction that was created by the harvest. I wish we could develop some better harvest strategies so that we don't have to do that, but it's one of the real challenges with following up after a crop where you've had a lot of foot traffic, but mainly it's mainly tractor and harvest rig traffic that's left some real serious ruts in the field. So that just gives you a little bit about, shows you a little bit about how intensive our tillage is. Now, when we, oh, did you want to add something to that, Mark? Before
I wanted to ask, is that in the furrows or in the beds? Because if you got permanently positioned raised beds, at least the grow zone is not suffering that compaction.
No, that's true. We usually don't keep permanent beds. We usually have to take down the beds and reform them between crops. There has been some work to try to minimize that, but it's usually we still will have to flatten out the field after. You might recycle beds from one crop, say a lettuce to the broccoli, but then after the broccoli you take it down and reform the beds. And usually the wheels of the harvest equipment usually is spaced so that it does go in the furrow bottoms, because with broccoli we will often harvest usually at least twice, say 5 days apart, but sometimes 3 times. And so the wheels of the harvest equipment goes in those furrow areas. Regarding the tillage depth of the cover crop, what we've been doing typically in the first period of our long-term study was to use a spader, a soil spader, which is somewhat similar to a rototiller, although it's a little better tillage implement, I think. And that goes down to, at least 12 inches deep. That is pretty deep, I understand that, but we've got a lot of biomass that we're trying to get in the ground. There's the need to then transition that field into the next vegetable. And these are the real life challenges that growers in our area face is, when you've got 6 feet or even 4 feet of beautiful cover crop standing in the field in, say, right now, and you've got to take that down, and then you've got to plant your next crop in, say, 4 to 6 weeks. We want to try to get that material buried into the field as soon as possible so that we can start making up our beds. And it's a challenge. These are not they're not simple systems. They're pretty hard. Yes. We're trying to improve things, but it's tough. And one thing I want to throw out there that I think could possibly help us reduce tillage is, and there's a video on this. It's kind of a strange or a little bit of a crazy concept that I've proposed is we would come in and we would harvest off all the biomass from the cover crop when it's much more succulent than normal, run it through an industrial juicing machine, squeeze out the juice from the pulp. That would give us a very residue-free field, which we could then come in and shallowly till, plant our next vegetable crop, and then use that liquid as a liquid fertilizer in our subsequent vegetable crop, hopefully applied through the drip irrigation system. And all the pulp, which we've saved, would be then applied back to the field when it's convenient. And there's a video on this. You can go check it out. It's a little bit of a crazy idea, but it's, I kind of like crazy ideas because we've got to try to come up with ways that we can integrate cover crops more simply into these systems. And I have a hunch this one might just work. We'll have to see though. But anyway, check it out. Just type in the web cover crop juice, and that video will probably come up.
I just want to make a plug for Eric Brennan's videos. He really makes excellent, very informative, and entertaining videos as well. So you might want to check out his YouTube channel. And I just, since we're speaking of challenges, I just want to ask one final question.
Can I make a response to this question too?
Okay.
I just wanted to validate the spading. Really impressed with that, with the spading machine for being both deep, and it doesn't pulverize the soil. It's almost like a mechanical broker. And I have talked to many growers here in the East who are very happy. Who have overall soil health building systems that include high biomass cover crops. So if you're going to go deep tillage, and I can certainly understand when you got 6 feet of fava beans and you want to get a good lettuce crop in there really quick, you got to get in there and till it up. I think the spading machine is the way to go, because there's some studies up in Washington State or Oregon. One of the Pacific Northwest universities did an OREI study, and they compared spading with just regular plow disc, and the spader vastly improved soil structure, much less compaction because of the way it works. And sometimes the spader gave better yield. So now when they do reduced tillage studies, their full tillage comparison treatment is the spader. So I know I talked about shallow tillage in that one example. It was one of those things I just didn't have time to mention because but I did mean to say that the spader is another way to do deep tillage that's not really that harmful to soil structure.
Okay, somebody very helpfully put in the cover crop, the juice video link into the chat box. So I'll just share that in a second. But meanwhile, I just want, one more person has a burning question here. We're almost out of time. So speaking of challenges, is there a cover crop that can be used to combat star and or Russian thistle? The area is Mediterranean, rainfall 13 inches per year, and the soils are silty loam and oak savanna surrounding landscape.
Star thistle and what was the other one?
Or Russian thistle.
Oh yeah, I know those are two bad ones. Is this cropland or pasture? Because I would think that those would if you got the right cover crops and the right timing. Again, it's not my region, but I bet you could find a combination of targeted tillage and cover crops that would take those out. Again, because of that low rainfall, you'd have to be a little careful how you choose. One of the things I understand what happens with some of these invasive exotic weeds is they invade these low rainfall regions in two ways. One is by sucking the soil profile dry, kind of like alfalfa, deep-rooted perennial weeds, they just suck it dry. And the other thing is to give off specific allelopathic chemicals, which are either directly antagonistic to native vegetation, native prairie plants, or are actually hostile to the indigenous soil biota, and that is a real challenge, and why it makes it important to try to get rid of these invasive exotics as opposed to weeds that are native to the region. And I believe star thistle and Russian thistle may have some of those properties. I would almost look at something like pearl millet, something that's got deep roots, but is not too greedy for moisture, recloses the canopy. And you want to have a combination. One thing you can do with these perennials is you till them up and you let them grow back till they got 3 leaves on it. Each little fragment puts up 3 leaves, then till it again. You actually set it back pretty good with a couple of passes like that. And yes, it's very hard on the soil. It's risky for wind erosion and everything. But the thing is to then get the right cover crop and the right timing. And one thing I meant to actually say this early on, but there's no way that a Virginia boy is going to tell you all how to cover crop. I'm not that familiar with your region, and even if I was, it's so site specific and season specific and soil specific that you really have to look at the general principles that we've gone over today and look at those cover crop charts and then select and then do some experimentation. And all I can say is good luck. If you find a solution to those two, great. Then you graduate to take on bindweed.
That's an excellent point, Mark. I agree 100%. The need for kind of knowing your site and finding out what others are doing in that region and experimenting, seeing what works. That's the way to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time, but I really want to thank everyone for all these really good questions. Thank you so much, Mark and Eric. It was great to have you both on together. And we hope that you can all join us for the other webinars in this series, which you can easily find by typing webinars by eOrganic into a search engine. So thank you both, and thanks to everyone for being part of this today.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.